We've got, I think, a great panel here, focused with a great set of people. Jamie, obviously, who's got a deep, I think from that introduction, you can see someone who really understands how things are made in a broad range of traditional industries. John Rubenstein, a great background in the electronics and consumer products, computing, mobile computing industry, a real leader in that space. And Paul has a strong background in pharmaceuticals, so three kind of big areas. And what we want to do is really have a pretty candid discussion on one of the core things that Nick laid out this morning, and that is, are we losing our competitive lead in manufacturing? Some people see a resurgence. Is there a resurgence occurring? And what are the factors that cause companies to decide where to put their manufacturing capabilities? And is there any changes that are occurring or that we could make occur that would change those outcomes? That's one kind of thread. And the other thread is this, there's also another dialogue, which Jamie mentioned some of the work at MIT really hops on and really tries to make this point, is that if creating value comes from making things, if you no longer make the things, do you use your edge in making value or not? And that's the dialogue we want to have. We'll try to start off with some questions to the panel. I'll ask a question. They'll decide whether they answer that question or want to tell me something else, which is how these things go. And then we'll have some time for a lot of dialogue with you folks. So maybe we could start with John at the end. So you started at HP and then went on to help develop the iPod and other products at Apple and lead Palm. So you've had a lot of participation in products that had significant growth in their volume delivered to the customer. So what are the factors that companies actually consider when they decide to invest in manufacturing facilities in China or the US? And have those changed over time?
God, I mean, we're going to get that.
So
We're going to find a way to include it.
just kind of use other side of page if necessary. If I look at doing products over the last, it's been 30 years. It started off with manufacturing.
It's a good point.
The entire unit in the U.S., but the parts would come from Japan. You kind of look at my passport over the years and see how things moved around, right? Then it moved to Singapore, then to Korea, then to Taiwan, then to China. And as it moved, more and more of the manufacturing and more of the design moved as well, all right, to where today, there's a significant piece of the design actually done overseas in partnership, with the companies that do these. In Apple's case, it's primarily Foxconn, but there's Compal, there's Quanta, there's a whole bunch of different companies that do this. I think that in the days where Apple was being pitched to move significant manufacturing into China, the biggest, the sort of the biggest marketing part of it was, and you said this really clearly, it was time to scale, right, and time to delivery of products, right? And so the question is you're designing a product, you need to deliver 10 million iPods for Christmas. You start shipments you can't start much later than beginning of September because Black Friday is Thanksgiving. How do you ramp up to 10 million for Christmas, with a 9-month or 10-month product development cycle? And so I think that forces a lot of decision process into moving into places where there's a large-scale manufacturing capability, there's a large-scale engineering capability, not from the creation of the idea, but from the creation of the specifics. There's a lot of what we did that leveraged from the work that Toyota, the Toyota production system. We actually used a lot of that in the development processes of how you develop products in conjunction with partners overseas to allow short cycle time development, but at the same time, deliver high quality products in high volume.
So there's, if I kind of am hearing you right, there's this idea of there will be a local ecosystem then of people that allows you to get to scale quickly. So it's more than just a big plant. It's a set of things that you're relying on.
It's
And so
manufacturing engineers, it's production workers, it's tools, right? I mean, how many people have sufficient number of machines that could actually machine parts in one place, right? And to hit those kind of volumes.
Paul, so you're doing some work in really around data to manage the J&J's supply chain, which we're going to come back to later. But in a general sense, in biopharm, how do people, manufacturers, from a development viewpoint and a manufacturing viewpoint, how do they look at the U.S.'s advantages and disadvantages versus other countries?
Great, Steve. Good morning, everyone. It's great to be here. So we're a little bit different in terms of the scalability just because of the overall cycle time. And I would say part of our approach is bifurcated by the technology. So if you look at small molecule entities, the chemistry world has moved to Asia very specifically. And that's for two reasons predominantly. One is a lot of the portfolio of our compounds in Asia are the older compounds. I mean, in China, our number one seller is Motilium, which was a compound discovered in 1950, right? So we tend to follow the products, but the second most important has been tax and cost, particularly for what I call commodity. For what I would say the higher innovation products, and going back to Nick's point of, if we're connected to the innovation, so stem cells, we're doing a lot of work on stem cells for retinal degeneration. Well, a stem cell really takes an integrated process. You need to develop it, you need to administer it in short time compared to our typical class of small molecule drugs, and you need to have surgical centers or collaborations that allow that surgery even to occur. So our investment really follows the commoditization of entities against the complexity of the innovation. So I think you would say in general, and Ann and others can comment, but our industry tends to be bifurcated on where we make the investment based on the complexity of the innovation that we're up against. So biologics, vaccines, stem cells, I'd say you'd see more US, Europe-centric. A general rule, this is 80-20. I'm sure someone will have an exception out there to quote. But on general rule, 80-20 tends to be US or Europe-centric, where you can really get that unique collaboration between R&D, between clinical center, between manufacturing, because it really requires that complete integration versus small molecule, which would be in Asia. Now that will change quickly. In the last 18 months, to Nick's point, we've invested in 4 innovation centers. 2 of the 4 are in the US, but 1 is in London and 1 is in Shanghai. And so you'll quickly see that mix change if more of the innovations come from Shanghai Innovation Center and the ecosystem around that versus the ones in the US.
So what drove the decision for Shanghai?
Really just because of the critical mass, more and more open collaborations with academia, with clinical centers than previously existed, which predominantly was an advantage in the United States, because I think the way we collaborate between academia, and when I say academia, both basic research as well as clinical research, has really always been at the forefront. But now I think you're seeing other regions of the world really capitalize on that integration of academia and industry, particularly in the pharmaceutical space.
So kind of if I play it back then, one of the back then to this question of, if you lose the manufacturing, do you lose the other part of the innovation chain? I think maybe in some sense you're saying
It's actually the opposite. It's
right?
the opposite direction it goes.
Right. It's that where it's highly innovative, there needs to be high bandwidth.
Correct.
Between manufacturing and design. So,
Yep.
but as people become more capable in the manufacturing of the low complexity things, then they invest in creating the innovative capability, which then
Will
brings
follow,
up.
right. So
Okay.
I think it's exactly as Nick had articulated earlier.
Very good. So, Jamie, I think it was a great articulation of the Toyota production system and the advantages, and interesting. I think you're prodding us to not assume that we can't be competitive even if we aren't today, right? Which I think is that whole, why do we believe we've kind of tapped this vein out? How has that notion of best practices evolved, and where do you see it evolving to over time?
Yeah, it's interesting. Something about the Toyota production system that is particularly challenging is it's something that you learn by doing. So in the examples that I mentioned where we reduce the lead time at these companies, the techniques and approaches to do that are pretty sophisticated. And the people that know how to do that at Toyota have been studying this for 25 or 30 years. They have a very, very high level of expertise to apply these simple principles of just-in-time and Jidoka into a customized situation. And the training that I've been through and that I train people through, it's very much learning by doing, not learning by concept. So it's interesting, we're working with a university now to figure out how can we make an undergraduate meaningful course in a school that's get undergraduate credit that has this high focus on doing, when their delivery method is very much focused on concept.
Right.
So, and by the way, I think in the engineering discipline and education, when I learned mechanics and thermodynamics and statistics, there's a great value of understanding those fundamentals, and you need to understand them properly. But when you get into applying some fundamental concepts to a very particularly complex situation, a really high level of skill is required. So what we do with these companies to try to get at how is this developed, when we go to work with a company, we pick a model area to work on where there's a very big business need, like I mentioned, like the filing cabinet. We're going to work and make that implement TPS at a very high level. That's the philosophy, the technical tools, and the managerial role. And in parallel to that, we want them to have 2 or 3 people that are working with us side by side that learn how to do this, that can then spread it. And that development process by doing in their company can take a couple years.
Jamie, I'm just curious because of my own selfish question here. Most of your work has been with individual companies, right? Company one-on-one, if you see on your list. Have you ever looked at industries? Because I think one of the challenges we have in pharmaceutical is if we actually collaborated more beyond the molecule,
right,
and actually, how a centrifuge runs or how a piece of equipment runs or how to do lean, we take a lot of work out of the system. So has there ever been targeted industrial collaborations in your...
We haven't done a lot of that. We would be very open to exploring that because we feel, and I think some of my energy may have come across this morning, is that there's a lot of opportunity out there. There is a lot of opportunity. The trick is it requires, in many cases, a very high level of skill. And Dave and I were talking at brunch this morning that in this lean movement that's happened over the last 20 years since the machine that changed the world that was studied, the easy stuff has been gotten. The companies have got some basic stuff, the quality stuff and stuff. What I'm talking about here is the more difficult stuff that can have a much higher impact. The one space where we've collaborated with a variety of folks that hasn't been in the industrial sector is working with some state governments. They have asked us to work with multiple agencies simultaneously. So we're trying to figure out how do we develop these TPS skills in multiple individuals in different areas at the same time. Did that get at you?
That's exactly.
Related question. You didn't mention anything about lean software. So there's a lean software movement, there's a lean startup movement.
Yeah.
I'd just be interested to hear your thoughts about the applicability of these concepts into other domains such as those.
Right. Okay. So we currently don't have any projects with a software manufacturer to apply these principles to the product development of software. Although, as you mentioned, Paul, I absolutely believe they apply. We apply them in engineering work at companies, and we apply them in engineering work at our company. I haven't seen it personally hand in the software development process. So we haven't done that. I imagine that it would apply. And what was your second question about?
The lean startup. So they're and I have personal experiences in both of these areas where, it's taking some of the principles, obviously the application and the science of how you apply at the
Right.
detailed level to a software development process is different.
Right.
But the notion of building in quality,
Right.
right? Designing testing harnesses as you design
Yeah.
the software so that you can, doing continuous releases. These are
Right.
practices that come from the lean production into the software
Right.
world. My personal experience with them has been fairly positive, and I'm just curious if there's any connection from you
Yeah.
guys or any
We
personal.
haven't done much with that, but I'll tell you one thing that we would love to do, and if you all have any ideas for this, I've been collaborating with my professor, actually, from MIT, Charlie Fine, who teaches in the Sloan School, and he and I have been talking about this. He said, Jamie, if TPS is really an organizational culture, wouldn't it be great if when we had a new company or a new business that was coming to market, that let's start working on building that from day one? And so if we could find some very interesting startups or new divisions of companies that were going into a new segment, we'd be very interested in that. The challenge that he says, and he and I have been talking about this, is when you get into a startup mode, there are a lot of other really big priorities, like can we get it on time? Is it good quality? Are the customers going to accept it? Do we have financing? And it's hard to put this at the top of the list for very understandable reasons. But we have found in companies like Herman Miller, when they've expanded into new areas, they've started it from the beginning, and that's been really helpful.
Very good. John, returning to you, you talked about kind of what happened with Apple and Palm, where the ability for consumer good products to scale so quickly and meet those, time is money in those markets, and that's what brought you to places in Asia that had that capability. But Apple has, recently reversed that with the decision to manufacture the Mac Pro in Texas. So what do you think drove that?
Well, I think, how much of the Mac Pro are they actually manufacturing in Texas is the first question that should be asked. And then, is that a product that's high volume from the perspective of Apple, right? And the answer is no, right? So even if they're manufacturing the whole thing, which I doubt,
right?
If you look at, for example, manufacturing in Brazil because of the tax requirements, everyone ships in subcomponents, right? They do final assembly. So I think it's certainly interesting to try bringing final assembly back to the U.S., especially for large devices where they're heavy and the transportation costs are pretty high. And I know that Foxconn wants to do more manufacturing in the U.S. or particularly south of the border in Mexico.
Why? Why do they want to?
Well, I think part of it is transportation costs. I think part of it is the costs in China are rising, right? And diversification, globally is a good thing. There's manufacturing over in Europe right now too, right? So there's final assembly that goes on in Czechoslovakia and places like that. So I think there are cases where it makes perfect sense. If you order a softcover book from Amazon, most of you probably think there's a huge warehouse someplace that's filled with softcover books, and if you think about the number of books they carry and how large a warehouse that must be, but no, you order a book, they print it and ship it to you. It's manufactured real time. And, you put an order, and an hour later it's being printed, and 2 hours later it's shipped.
Right.
So that's real-time manufacturing going on in the U.S.
So one source of comparative advantage then for the U.S. is simply co-location of point of need and point of production to shorten that time. Are there other, I'd like each of you to kind of comment on your view of what would you say are the current potential sources of advantage for the U.S. and then what potential sources of advantage for the U.S. Might be. So maybe we'll start with Paul.
So, I think for us, again, it goes to this integration of services, right? So I think we're trying to move in the pharma industry away from, here's your pill, come back, 30 days, get your pill again. It's really about how can you bundle services pre the disease, right? Preventing the disease, during the disease interception, and as you're being treated for the disease, that overall period. And depending on the therapeutic area, I think the value, it more goes back to a systems integration view, right? So how do we develop apps that help people understand when they should take their medicine, when they can enhance their adherence? So I think a lot of it can be by tying together our terrific healthcare system, although everyone has different opinions on it, but in reality, the healthcare system with the delivery mechanism. And we have a lot of conversations nowadays with hospitals and the like of how do we, you know, if you think about Johnson, medical device, consumer goods, pharmaceutical goods, well, we go to a healthcare company and we come across as 225 different companies. How do we do that better, and how do we get value to the patient sooner? So a lot of it, to me, is we can get value in the States by better integration across the whole entire system.
So it kind of comes back to that understanding what is the source of value, and you're saying the source of value is not only, you know, kind of in this pill that's produced, it is integrating that into a whole, you know, wellness or care process.
Correct.
For that customer, and if you look at that system, then there are significant opportunities.
In the U.S., right, particularly, because, you know, just taking medication, if you look at neuroscience, you know, if you get patient adherence greater than 60%, that's great, right? And the reality of it is you'd like that to be 100%. So can you create the ecosystem between all your healthcare environments, your pharmaceutical innovations to get 100% compliance, which is only going to help the patients that need that medicine?
Yeah, it's an interesting area, actually. We're doing work in exactly that adherence. And how do you use apps and social, social interactions to kind of help people make the right choices for themselves. So it's more than that pill. Keep on going, Jamie?
Yeah, so I think the current advantages, I'll talk from the perspective of what we do at Toyota making vehicles, which wasn't what I was mainly talking about this morning, and also I see with our companies. Yep. So I think the current advantages that we can build on, number one, if there's a product where we're physically very close to the customer and the customer needs, that's a huge advantage. So for example, in our world, when we engineer a minivan or a large pickup truck or the interior of a Camry, the big customers of those are here in the United States or the Avalon. Having our engineers in Ann Arbor very close physically to the customers, understanding the customer needs is an enormous advantage. If your engineers and your people designing it are users of that product. So I think that proximity to the customer and insight is very helpful in many industries. We have a big market and we have a diversified market, so we should be able to take advantage of that. Secondly, and this also applies at Toyota, I think our national culture is inherently very innovative. We're a very open society to new ideas, to bold ideas. It goes deep to the history of our country. This was very well documented in that production, the Innovative Economy Society. We see that internally to Toyota, where we have a pretty diverse workforce, and we get a lot of ideas that come out of that. And I think we're open. So I think that's a strength. And I had mentioned two others. I think that still, and it was mentioned a little bit this morning, our undergraduate and graduate education system is very strong globally, and we're very open to bringing in students from all over the world there. I think, though, what's really key is that we have to work this immigration such that people that come here and want to stay and work here can do that.
Seems kind of obvious, doesn't it?
Yeah, and there's a lot of history of that about people that have made major contributions to our economy because they wanted to be here. And I think it's important that we make it friendly for that to happen. I think on what could potentially be an advantage what we need to work on very hard is I was very struck by all this work with the MIT study about the absence of ecosystems in this country to help small companies grow. And that was really very intriguing to me, and I never realized what it appears to be a huge gap we have in that area compared to other countries. And it would seem to me that if we can close that gap and put some really good thinking, and maybe some of that will come out of this study, that may really open a lot of doors to things that we don't see right now.
So I'd like to ask a couple follow-ups before
Yeah.
I go into John, because I think a couple really interesting things you touched on there. And that last one, right? So I come from Silicon Valley, John does. We would listen to you say that and say, what?
Oh, no, I would agree with him. I think Silicon Valley is a very unique place in a point in time. But I think we're seeing a dramatic shift occurring, right? And you're seeing it in San Francisco, you're seeing it in Seattle, you're seeing it in New York, where the city, the urban campus, right, is becoming really important. Right? And I think that there's a tremendous amount of innovation occurs when you pile lots of really young, excited, driven people into a small area and an environment. Interestingly enough, San Francisco is fighting this, which is ridiculous. Right? Seattle seems to be embracing it, except for an occasional, protest every now and then. But Amazon's building huge towers, and then real estate developers are building, homes, big towers filled with apartments, so that people can walk to work, they can all live and function in an area. And I think that's a dramatic shift that's occurring that I think is really positive, because I think it will help innovation tremendously.
What do you think of what Tony Hsieh's doing in Las Vegas?
Same kind of thing,
Right.
right? I'm not sure I would have picked Vegas to do it, but hey, there's no accounting for taste.
Right. But is that what you were talking about, Jamie, that kind of thing, that kind of create this, when you talked about the lack of the ecosystem for small companies?
Well, what I was struck with in the MIT study is they compared what is the environment for a small company to take root in the United States versus, I believe, Germany. And they described all these disadvantages we have in the US compared to Germany. And when I read that, I was really stunned by that. What I mean by that is, what do they have access to? They have access to local collaboration amongst companies to share ideas and technology. They have well-trained vocational schools, vocational people. They have access to funding that can help them get over certain hurdles. They have a deep supply network and a whole variety of structures. The reason why that rings true to me is because before I joined Toyota, I worked at Chrysler for 15 years, and I was the co-chairman of a joint venture between BMW and Chrysler to design and build an engine, which we built in Brazil, that went into the original BMW Mini. And when I went down to Brazil to launch and build this engine plant to get it up and running, there were all these things that I took for granted in the US that they didn't have.
Right.
That became major roadblocks. And we spent a lot of time working on that, and we worked our way through that. And when I read the MIT study, I said, my gosh, if that's what they're saying in this book is the difference between the US and these other countries, we've got a lot of work to do. Also, that's not in my field, but at the PI meeting that Dave and I were at, there were a lot of people in the biotech field. I was very surprised to say that they have this new idea, many of them for right out of the MIT labs, and they're scaling up production outside the United States. And when you asked why, these are people that said, well, we looked at the US, we looked at these different areas, and the ecosystem was the term they used, isn't there. Right. We don't have skilled people, we don't have a work ethic, we don't have work ethic meaning we don't have a legal environment that will allow us to hire and train people very rapidly. There are a whole host of things that we're missing. So that's not the area that I work in directly with the small companies I work at, but I think from what I'm reading that may be a huge opportunity, because we seem to be very weak in that area, and that there's a big gap. And if we can close some of it, it might have a big impact.
Very good, very helpful. I mean, one thread in there you've touched on a couple of times, I'd like to dig a little deeper on, is the workforce. Mm-hmm. You talked about some of the advantages of the American workforce, that culture of innovation, and you talked about the quality of our graduate schools. What are some of the disadvantages? As you work, you've gone to Brazil and Japan, and how would you characterize the advantages of workforce in other environments, and are there things we could do, to improve that?
Yeah, the advantages and disadvantages. Well, I think the challenges of the workforce now, of the high school graduate and the vocational school graduates, are very well documented in a lot of studies. So I won't comment a lot about that, about where we have some gaps as a nation in a variety of industries.
But I guess it would actually, have you seen it play out? I mean, there's these studies and, how you do on tests, but as you pointed out, some of the things that you're doing, it's much more than the conceptual.
Yeah.
It is doing.
Yeah.
So talk about, your experience with workforces across the
Oh,
globe.
okay. So
How
where
that
yeah.
plays
So
out.
here I'll give you some examples of where we see some challenges. Some of the companies that I mentioned up over there are growing, and they need to hire new people to work inside this system on the factory floor.
Right.
Okay. And what they're looking for is people that are high school graduates or vocational school graduates that can run CNC equipment, that have that are very industrious, that will come to work every day, that will pass a drug screen,
Right.
okay, that are team players, that can problem solve and improve, that they can develop and grow within the company. Okay, when we review the data, when they try to select people, okay, they have to look at a lot of candidates to find people that will fit, even in very good local wages and benefits. Now, my experience I think that's the kind of practical thing.
Yep.
I will say one other thing. I've had the great pleasure at Toyota of working with a lot of people from Japan, and I had the great pleasure of working in Brazil. Those are collectivist cultures. They value teamwork and collaboration very highly. And before I moved to Brazil, the Brazilians said, "You Americans are very individualistic. You're very individual." I didn't understand what they meant. I didn't understand. I kept saying, what do you mean? Until I worked with them. Their capacity for teamwork and problem solving in this system, to me, was just stunning. And I see it with my boss and many of the Japanese that I work with when we have to work on intense projects together. They have a natural affinity for teamwork, collaboration, put the benefit of the team above the whole, help everybody else. We're all learning, and we're more individualistic. And I believe that there's a place where the individualism is a strength.
Yeah.
Don't get me wrong. I just think that that is can be a liability in some cases. The kind of engineering work that we do, getting back to what we talked about this morning, the kind of engineering that's needed to work to make TPS work when you're in production is collaboration. These are complex problems. We need a lot of disciplines to come together, and when we have people that are collaborative, team-oriented, it's a huge help.
Very good. Yeah, and I resonate with some of your comments from my experience.
But have you just figured out, is that because of just the general culture or because they do something different in their education process?
In Japan and Brazil, I'm not really sure. I've done a lot of reading about that's the nature of their culture and some of the causes. I'm not sure, but I do that's my experience.
Yeah.
One of the things I want to get each of your thoughts on this, ties back to something I mentioned earlier with you, Paul, about really looking at data sharing to manage the supply chain. And today we talk about data as a source of new value creation opportunities. So again, as we look forward for the U.S., understanding where are the new ways to create value and the new sources of value, if we can understand those and prepare for those and lead those, and that's a way to have a leadership. So maybe each of you, if you could each kind of comment on where you think, where is value migrating to, where are the new sources of value, and again, what we might do to participate in those.
Yep. So I think data for us is one of our biggest challenges in pharmaceutical. I mean, I ran clinical trials, and 2 years ago, our approach to clinical trials, 3,000 clinical trial sites, was to deliver a personal computer to each clinical trial site because we thought that was the way to guarantee security of the data. So our perceptions of the regulatory environment, and there was this little old lady, I can still picture her. She was 85 years old. She ran a clinical trial site, and she opened up a file cabinet. It wasn't one from your company, so it was a file cabinet, and she had 15 computers in there, and she had all the names of the companies on there. And because every company was convinced the only way to meet the regulated environment that they translated was by having their own things. And she says, I have usernames and passwords for everything. And for you at J&J, it's even worse because you have 10 passwords because none of your groups talk to each other.
And
right?
she wrote all those down on a sheet of paper and she kept it in her desk.
Well, actually, funny
which
enough,
was more secure.
she had them on a Post-it pinned to the top, company by company. So it was tremendous. So we blew all that up and went to the cloud for executing our clinical trials. But I will tell you, with unbelievable perceptions of pain and a perception that we're going to create this huge security breach for patient confidentiality. So I think the big challenge for us on data is how can we innovate, how can we keep up with the innovations in technology with a regulatory mindset and framework that protects patients and the integrity of their data, but allows us to enjoy the speeds of the technology advancement. And to do that not just for clinical data, but manufacturing data. And ideally that I should be, you know, one of the things I said in 1998, I did an FDA training. And they said, well, what you're trying to set up here in manufacturing, we should be able to watch your plant from Rockville, Maryland. And I said at the time, I think the companies that do that in 2015 will be most successful, not knowing 2015 would come so quick, right? And we're here now, but in reality, we're not any closer to that, right? We tend to keep the agencies away instead of collaborating with them. And across the board, I think the agencies have done, the FDA in particular has really done a great reach out. But we're still a little bit hesitant of, well, would you really open up and let them log on to your manufacturing system and watch your plant? In my opinion, we should, because that would keep them from having to travel everywhere. Then they could focus more on how do we collaborate on introducing the next technology. So to me, there's a huge advantage of one, we're not keeping up with the speed of innovation in the technology world, given regulatory perceptions, as well as our own perceptions of if we open up our house to everybody to look at, we may be shut down before we, continue on, because a perception, a little alarm point causes issue.
Okay, so if I kind of,
Yeah.
Frame it back, it's kind of saying, can we change the regulatory environment to be from the judicial model, that the two opposing sides, to the partnership model?
Yeah, which I think has happened. It's a matter of how quickly we can do that. Yeah.
And in particular, to do that in a way that is looking forward to leveraging, technology faster,
Yeah.
right? How do we, as partners, enter into that?
Yeah, like if you think about electronic medical records, right? If I go to a clinical site in China, every patient's on an electronic medical record. The U.S.,
Yeah, well,
that's hit or miss.
Right.
And there's reasons for that, I understand, but the reality of it is it's not a technology issue. The technology exists. It's more of a collaboration issue between the healthcare system, the industry, and the regulatory agency.
Is that ease of access then to information and data overseas about people in places like China and India, is that actually one of the reasons that some of the innovation work gets done there, because the friction and access to data is easier?
I think you can access clinical data much easier.
Is that in the end, is that when people are sitting in the room talking about what to do where, is that a real factor?
It certainly contributes, right?
Okay.
Because your speed to analyze that data and to decide, if you look where we want to go to adaptive trial designs for clinical trials, right? And not just stay and hope the statistics work out. You want to be able to change a course of therapy during that, and having that real-time data access is critical.
So just in time.
Yeah, just in time data, yeah.
As well.
Do you want to go first, or you want?
Sure. I think we're falling into a little bit of a trap here, because as Dan pointed out, the manufacturing's gone, right? And so I think we should focus less on, the devices we're talking about, and look more at software and how to put all those transistors together that are, they're like grains of rice, right? Because I think that's where there's tremendous value that can be created. And every device, okay, so I got this cute little Pebble, right? And I don't know how many you know about Pebble, but they were the #1 Kickstarter product. They went to raise $1 million, they raised $10 million, right? It's a smart watch, so it talks to your phone and stuff, right? You can go to Asia, have one of these things made for you, in a week, right? It's not a big deal, right? They got some cool stuff, but at the end of the day, the product itself is in the software. Right, and it's in the application store, and it's in the ecosystem around the device itself. Your Fitbit, it's all about moving data up to the cloud. Right? It's all about analyzing that data. And as we pour more and more data up to the cloud, right, what are you going to do with that data? And that's where there's going to be tremendous innovation. That's why Google just spent $3.2 billion for Nest. I assume they wanted more than a thermostat for their offices. And because there's tremendous data that comes from those devices. In home automation, wearable devices, you're going to have stuff all over your clothes and everything in a couple of years. And the amount of data then that gets processed that will do good things for you right, is all possible, is all about innovation. Right? The development of the chips that allow you to do those things. Right? You know, how do you use all those transistors? That's tremendous innovation. Right? I mean, what makes the car go now is software. Right? I mean, yeah, you guys put motors and engines and stuff together, but it's all about processors and software in there. And you know, I mean, if you look at a Tesla, you know, one could argue that it's just really an accessory. Right? And it's, you know, the software that makes that thing go is what a big accessory. But you know, this is all about software, and I think that you know, that there's tremendous value to be created here in the U.S. That we have the basic infrastructure in place, and I think that we could do a lot of things to enhance that infrastructure. And Silicon Valley has some of those, but I think they could go even further. And you know, self-driving cars, someone was talking about before, is you know, clearly coming. That's all software. That's all about the cloud. It's all about cars interacting with each other. You know.
So one way to kind of play back is value is being created at the integration of software and hardware to create services for people.
Mm-hmm.
So this notion, you know, because I share some of your thoughts on it. I think even this partitioning perhaps between, oh, there's services and there's manufacturing. What do you mean when you know, the value comes from the data in the clinical trials to then do adaptive, you know, medicine for individuals? Is it a service? Is it a manufacturing good? You know, do we maybe have the wrong framing and measurement systems in place to even understand what's going on?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. You know, and you know, you're talking about how difficult it is to move medical data or whatever. You know, I can't say I know anything about, you know, the industry, but my guess is it's a people problem, not a
Absolutely.
right. I mean, if the CIA can move their stuff to Amazon Web Services, there's no reason why you guys can't.
Again, a lot of it's perception, a lot of it's that partnership to move it forward.
Jamie, any comments you want?
No, I think Paul's comments about John's
No
comments about the personal devices, that's going to extend in the automobile space,
Absolutely.
like you mentioned. And so you're going to see automobiles, it's already happening, where the personal devices are connected to the automobiles. The automobiles will collect a lot of information about how they're used. That will go back to manufacturers. It will go back to dealers. A lot of that information, probably through the cloud, can be processed in a variety of different ways, which we'll see be used for new types of innovation. The only other one thing that I would say that's a pretty big breakthrough in this field, it's not really about data, but it's about the use of computing power, is that certainly in our industry, you know, computer-aided engineering and those techniques are getting far more sophisticated to be able to simulate physical testing environments electronically and digitally. And as that grows, it's already happening in the automobile industry. You're able to shrink the lead time and the capital costs that it takes to build things, produce less physical prototypes. I think we'll see that happen in a lot of industries. And as the value of that comes up, I think there'll be opportunities for innovation in those fields about software work, and that's coming on.
And so just on that, so where does Autodesk do a lot of its innovative software? Office buildings in downtown San Francisco.
Yeah.
Right?
I did have, can I make a comment on another topic that came into my mind? This one story that I wanted to share that that's related to this topic that's interesting. I don't know if many of you know this, but General Electric used to have a very large appliance park in Louisville, Kentucky, where they made a lot of their appliances, dishwashers, washing machines, refrigerators.
It's called Appliance Park.
It's called Appliance Park. And they have recently, in the last several years, and a lot of that production went out of the United States. So when you go to Home Depot or Lowe's and get your refrigerator, washer, dryer, they're not made here in the U.S. They are now bringing a lot of that back to Louisville, Kentucky. I haven't been there yet. I've been invited. I plan to see that. I'll be at a conference next week where I'll meet some of their folks. I think that's going to be a very interesting case study to watch, because what they're saying, it relates to what I said before, which was, wait a minute, there are a lot of opportunities to improve by making things sure that it wouldn't think of. They're getting a lot faster speed to getting the right product to their customers. Obviously, Jeffrey Immelt's a very influential national figure. So I think that was a really good one to look at, because I would look at appliances from a TPS model and say, if they're We're selling it at Home Depot and Lowe's. We should be making it here. That just fits perfectly. And related to the data, what they're finding is that appliances are getting a lot more intricate with hardware and software in terms of what they can do. And so they're innovating in that field, and they're finding if they're close to the customer who's using the sophisticated or wants more sophisticated appliances, and they're engineering it here, and they're making it here, and they get the lead time. It works pretty well. So this is a mix of...
Well, and there's another aspect to it, too. So I bought, the fanciest LG washer and dryer you can buy. The user interface is a disaster. All right? I mean, you can barely figure out how to turn the thing on, and it does everything, but you can't figure out how to work it, right? And so there needs to be, discipline and art around those user interfaces. That's something that we're particularly good at here.
Well, maybe let me open up to the audience and see what questions, comments. I'll let
So John talked about Amazon. Sure. My name is Cal Mann. I have been a consultant to large consumer products for the last 30 years, including Handspring, a long time ago. The question was, you talked about Amazon and its ability to print an individual order real time in the United States. And I haven't heard anybody mention 3D manufacturing, what the implications are. So I'd just like to hear from each of you, is that smoke and mirrors? Is it something real? And if it is, how do you see that playing out over the next 5-10 years?
Well, I can and it's certainly not an area of my expertise, but I can probably connect you with people in our device area, but we are using 3D printing, a lot of work going on, and even how we do develop cardiac tools, for instance, or even knees. Like if we make a knee, we're using 3D printing to basically generate the knee in many cases. So there's a whole new reality that will reshape that manufacturing side of the business from a device viewpoint that I think is very powerful. And will really get people the chance, particularly in surgical intervention tools, to understand, beyond just computer simulation, which I think is good, but also you can actually create physical models with 3D printing that will allow you to redesign based on an individual patient's characteristics and needs, which I think will be tremendous.
And Autodesk has products today that basically do that. You do you do a design, you simulate it, and you print it. Right now, is it ready today for where you order a product online and and it prints it and mails it to you? No, but is that going to come at some point in time? Of course.
Yeah, and I, to build on that, I think it's a larger, and to build on your, the example of the pebble. I think it's a kind of, it's the tip of an iceberg, and most of the action is below the water in the sense of it's not about 3D printing, but it's about, John, you talked about kind of software, eating everything, and that's what's happening here in terms of how things are made. And what it's doing is, people love 3D printing because it allows all of us to be a creator. But you need more than the 3D printing to be a creator. You need the computer-aided engineering tools. You need access to those value chains in China. You say, yeah, anyone can go into China and make something, but it's actually kind of hard. You got to have, but there's company I'll point out called Dragon Innovations, who, that's what they do. If you're a hardware startup, they'll help you go find a value chain in China. So I think the change there is that it is unleashing the ability for a much broader set of people to be creators of products. And it's coupled with changes in funding models like Kickstarter, which mean, in today's world, you either have to convince a VC that there's $1 billion company behind your product, or you have to convince your boss at a big company there's $1 billion new business unit. But if it's a $5 million business, nobody wants it, except you as like each of us as individuals, build a $5 million a year business, selling phone cases on Etsy, that's not a bad gig. It's unleashing, the demand for it is a sign of that's a latent demand, and technology through robotics, 3D printing is evolving to allow that demand.
Very, very interesting and very stimulating, and I thank you all very much. I'm not going to try to comment on everything you said, but I want to just change the conversation slightly and move it to a different space.
skills. It's one thing to have all of the intellectual skills to create the environment, to do the invention, discovery, and beginnings of innovation. Tell me about the skills below that. Tell me about the technical skills, the technician skills, the direct labor skills. What do they need to be? How do they fit in the way you see your businesses or you think about, you know, building this innovation economy? Where are the bulk of the people? Because it's not the bulk of the people up here that are doing all of this work. Mm-hmm. This is in the hands of reasonable numbers of people, whether they're given visas or not, Jamie. But in the end, it's the workers. Can you comment on that, each of you?
Sure. Well, I mean, I can start. For us, we have a big concern that we can get that pipeline of talent into the manufacturing jobs, right? And to be honest, that's in the US and across the board. So we're building a new plant in China for a legacy portfolio, but our current plant is 100% people-based, no automation whatsoever. So now to introduce automation into a new plant because we can't afford the rising prices in China, which is kind of interesting, and from a 15% year-on-year salary growth, we're going to have to automate it. But when we go to automate the plant, the base personnel at the manufacturer, supervisor, operator level doesn't exist. So now we're building training centers and, you know, software simulation centers to get them up to speed. Same thing exists, and I think it goes back to what Jamie said. If you look at our plant floors for our very complex technologies, we're trying to integrate the process world with the analytical world and really get rid of analytical testing in the lab. Well, we've unfortunately built a very segmented view of the world. The process operator only worried about the process, measure the temperature, measure the pressure, didn't have to worry about an infrared and the whole modeling behind that because that was going to happen in a lab. Well, in the reality, you want them to do that. So we almost need the operators that used to exist. When I started my career at DuPont did that, Dow did that, but for some reason we separated that out as a skill set, and now we're going to have to recreate it. And there isn't really a critical mass of schools that do that. I think most of our engineering schools tend to teach more concept than if I go to, say, a European school. I use University College Dublin as a for instance. Very hands-on, pharmaceutical-based processing integration, right, versus, say, some of our academic institutes in the U.S. So we are very worried. So we're investing in, you know, community colleges, programs. A lot of the states, you know, I had built a plant in Massachusetts. I know New York has programs where they're trying to really develop that next wave because the 35-year supervisors, tenured, they're gone. They've all retired. They've taken what they deserve because they did great things in our industry. There's not a lot of people coming along because most of those people coming along, if their college degree, only want to stay in that job for a year or 18 months. They don't want to stay in that type career for 35 years. So the last part I'd make, is we need to get the human resource processes to also be able to move these people and keep them stimulated within that environment and also create the diversity, both gender and thinking across all the plants, because a plant that's all 100%, you know, people from Athens, Georgia, and all 100% people from, you know, Seoul, Korea, isn't as strong as a plant that could really mix those. But our human resource practices don't really allow us to move, you know, mid-level engineers very easily because the cost model is very prohibitive. So we need to come up with some way to create a more fungible, transportable workforce that's trained in this integration of process and analytical.
I'm not sure I have a good answer. You know, I mean, clearly there's a lot more software testing, you know, and analysis and stuff that needs to be done that there are people to do. I mean, you look at the Obamacare website disaster. I don't know why that happened, but clearly someone wasn't managing things correctly because they had a lot of people on it. But you know, I think in general, education is, crucial in this. One of the things I spend a lot of time doing is trying to help companies hire people, because there is, even in Silicon Valley, there just is not enough people to get all the work done. And so I think that for every computer scientist, for every engineer, that builds an ecosystem around it that's required to support that. Also requires maybe people with not as many skills, but skilled people as well. So, but that's not a good answer to your question of how do you fix the problem, because I have no idea.
Yeah, I'll just make, I'll answer the question by way of an example. Before I had this job working with TPS, I worked with Toyota suppliers for about 7 years. And I worked with suppliers that were introducing new technology into automobiles. So we would go from concept to production for some innovative features for the vehicles, particularly bringing innovation out of North American companies and trying to get it into vehicles. So in that space, Nick, typical thing that we're running at is we have a concept for some new technology that's going to add a feature to the vehicle. We have to make prototypes like we talked about. So then we have to do a lot of development testing. In the automobile world, we need something that's going to last 20 years. So there's a whole host of engineering of make a prototype. How do I test it if it's new technology? What are the testing parameters? This would be the field of test engineering. And then behind the test engineering, there's a lot of, I'm a mechanical engineer. I like engineering. There's a lot of interesting, practical, engineering work that really needs to be thought through in a customized situation. So you have to divide testing parameters. Then you have to revise the components. Then you've got a concept that passes product requirements for testing. There's a lot of, like I said there, engineering and prototyping that goes in there. Then you go in the manufacturing world. When you go in the manufacturing world, you have to design the process equipment that's going to make this new technology that meets the product requirements that are already there. Well, what's happening there? Dave Hart teaches this at MIT, I think, still. There's a lot of process parameter optimization and decision making that has to go on to how do you control a process to get the product requirements you want. That can get pretty sophisticated. Then when you've got all that run, you've got this new technology up, you can make it, can meet the product requirements. Then you've got this issue of hiring and training the people that are going to run the process and hiring and training the maintenance people that are going to be maintaining it. So you've got the maintenance and production people. So I think it goes through that whole, there's a lot that happens after the initial concept of various skill levels, from pretty sophisticated engineering to good technicians to good people to work on the shop floor. I don't find that working with Toyota as the suppliers we work with as a problem. That actually worked quite well with some of the companies. Could we get better at it? Yes, but that gives you an idea of the portfolio of skills that are required.
About the question. Donna Blackman, Scripps Research Institute. This is more for my area is more towards the pharmaceutical or chemical industry, but the idea about education and talking about training the major part of the workforce, I think it's also a question of upper levels also, BS degrees and beyond, but if you think about chemistry, chemical reactions, we teach students how to monitor or measure the rate or the parameters of a chemical reaction the same way we did 100 years ago. We have much better analytical tools and much better computer tools, and we still teach them how to do this the way it was done 100 years ago, and it's really inefficient. I'm just trying to ask mainly Paul, I guess, but everybody else, if there's some way that we can, is academia part of our problem, the people that are teaching the students? Can we somehow bring a more data-driven approach, certainly to chemistry, but maybe other fields too? And I can see getting involved in a VOTech kind of program, but how are you going to do this at the major universities where they're still doing a very, very archaic approach to teaching?
I think your point, Don, is right. There's two separate problems.
Can we
right?
quote you on that in the report, Don?
Two separate issues. There's the VOTech to get the guys comfortable with the computers, but even the engineers in terms of what they're taught. We end up retraining everybody for what we need, and part of that is as an industry, for instance, we could say this is what we want to train people on. I'm amazed. We're starting this week. We just announced the group J&J Production Systems, all right? And I sit there and go, why can't we just steal what Toyota has? Now that I know Jamie, maybe we will. But, right? So we're putting all these FTEs in it. But going back to base chemistry, like, McCabe-Thiele diagrams, people don't need to do anymore, right? The computer does them for you. You have to figure out how to apply them. I think industry could help by opening up problems that are of real interest as well and giving the students access to data sets real time. Chemistry issues, something inherent. Yeah.
There's something about extracting more from the data that we're taking.
Right.
It's the whole problem about all this stuff up in the cloud. We're making use of less than 5% of the data we actually take
Right.
when we do a chemical reaction. There's a lot, we could do a lot more.
A lot more fundamental modeling, analytics that the students aren't necessarily capable of assembling all that data and using it for beneficial use. It's there, and they're taught very specifically chemical kinetics, but they're not necessarily taught, well, what does that mean of the value of the product or the quality of the product going out at the end of the
So
day.
in general, there's a sloppiness
Right.
that has happened. Not to pick on you, I mean, the reason software people do what they do is because they've gotten very lazy and very sloppy about the way they use computer resources. And, you're talking about the sloppiness of data. It's easier to get it than it is to work with it. It's easier to, just keep collecting it. So what I like to think about and torture you with is, wouldn't we be better off if we had less resources? Wouldn't we become more innovative if we couldn't do everything? I mean, the Russians certainly behaved that way. When the Iron Curtain was up, they seemed to do phenomenal things with the fewest number of computers ever seen in the world. Other countries seem to be able to do this as well, India, Africa. Do you think about this at all, kind of learning from other cultures that don't have the overabundance of resources that we have here?
Resource curse.
I'm sorry?
It's called the resource
The resource curse. That's exactly right.
And by resources, you mean both gadgets and tools as well as people.
Everything. I mean, we're
Yeah,
blessed,
yeah.
aren't we? I mean, just what Donna said. I mean, if you want more data, you collect more data. It's like, and what do you do with it? I have no freaking idea, but I got it. You've got a terabyte, you got an exabyte, you got a yottabyte. I mean, we got yada, yada, yada. I mean, and what are you doing with it? I have no idea, but I'll have it. And I'll just take 2 pieces over here and 2 pieces over there. And we don't seem to engage our brain, our engineering skills, our engineering talents, to borrow your phrase, Dan, to kind of, you go somewhere else where they have nothing. And you say, how did they do that? How did they create that with the fewest number of resources? I mean, seriously, we're all traveling into space to visit the Russian space station. I mean, God forbid if you only knew how the hell they put that thing up there. They were kind of all like rules of thumb. They didn't have a big computer system that put that up there. Our most sophisticated things, went up and fell down. I mean, so go figure.
Yeah.
Go figure. I mean, how'd that work?
Well, at least for us in farm, our problem is we do this complicated thing called Homo sapien data integration, which is basically take a couple pieces and we take PhDs and we have them type them into Excel spreadsheets, and then they hold the Excel spreadsheet.
Right.
And you can never connect it end to end. And that's why I'm very interested in using Amazon.com and other to really
Spread it out.
cherry pick the data that you need, to Donna's point, and bring it together quickly. Because right now we do, I tell you, I have people sitting they bring to the quality group photocopy sheets, fax pages, and Excel sheets where they sat there and hit the data in, because we're so far behind in bringing the data forward like other industries would be. I visited Air Products. There's 4 guys running 400 liquid nitrogen plants, right? We have 8 guys standing around 1 reactor, right? So we have to fundamentally change it. But to your point, the speed to bring that up and get the data there, and then getting enough people who know what to do with the data once it's cherry picked is hard. So we do need to fundamentally change that skill set and also our thinking, because we've thought about things from a plant up versus the reality of it is no product within J&J Pharma is made completely within J&J. So we have to think more from the top and zap that information down wherever we want to make it, and then bring it up and start really using modeling like other industries have, and take advantage of more modern tools to do that. So.
Someone's trying to ask a question here for a while.
Hari Pujar from Merck. Question for Jamie. So I don't know if you know Michael Porter. He's a professor at Harvard Business School. And he posits that operational excellence, which you talked about, is not a key element of competitive strategy. That is, it's not sustainable. So I want to get your thoughts on that. And second question, we had a CEO at Merck who was an evangelist about operational excellence, and in fact, he had metrics for how many black belts, yellow belts, green belts that you would have in various parts of the company. It stuck in manufacturing. It did not stick in research. And I think there's a lot of lost value as a result. So I was wondering if you have any thoughts on how to correct that.
Yeah, my first comment about Michael Porter's work, which I have read, is my understanding is in the strategy field, he is not, there are differences of opinion about this. He has his, and there are other people in that field. And then I would secondly say at Toyota, the Toyota production system is our core competency. It is key to our competitive strategy, and it's worked pretty well for us over a lot of years. And we're seeing it applied out in innovation space too, when you look at hybrid electric vehicles and fuel cell vehicles and the stuff. So in our industry, in our sector, in terms of what we do, we find it's absolutely core to our competitive strategy. I haven't had a chance to talk with Michael Porter directly about this and debate this, but I have talked with a number of his colleagues at Harvard that have differences of opinion about that. So I would leave it at that. But I do think, one thing I do want to be clear, I would not advocate that TPS or competing through operations makes sense in every operation. I want to be clear about that. When we go to companies and they call us a small to mid-sized company to look at it, one of the first things we're looking at is what does your business need? What do you need to prove? And in the operating side, is there something we can do applying this Toyota production principles of just-in-time and Jidoka to improve a product or service in the areas that I mentioned, quality, lead time, or cost and productivity. In some cases, it doesn't fit. It shouldn't be one of the top things. So I want to be clear about that. In the area of the R&D function, I will say this, these concepts of the Toyota production system are most easily understood in a physical process when you're making something, where you can physically see how things flow, and you can grasp the concepts. People that have done that for a while and have practiced it, then they can go into an area, an R&D area, an administrative area, an engineering area, and apply the same principles where you just can't see things flowing so easily. So I think we do that at Toyota. I mean, we apply these principles very much there in Ann Arbor, Michigan. I've seen them at work. It's a little more difficult for people that are early in the stages to understand it in that concept. I wouldn't recommend starting there.
Well, I think we should wrap things up. I'd like you to join me in thanking the panel.
Thank you. Thank you.